Welcome to the final round of the Regent Cup debate. Today we started with 18 teams and now we are down to 2. This is our opportunity to engage in an Oxford-style debate on a controversial topic. As you already saw, the prompt is controversial speakers should be banned from campuses. You've already lodged your initial vote. I'm going to explain a little bit about the procedure today to give you the phases of our debate, and then I'm going to introduce our judging panel to you. So there's going to be 3 rounds in this debate. The first round is going to involve the opening statements presented by one student from each team. After they present their opening statements, we will then go into the second round. The second round is a 30-minute cross-examination or an opportunity for the students to answer questions from the moderator and the audience. So we ask for your active participation in asking questions to the students in the second round. In the third round, what we will have is a summation by one student from each team. At the conclusion, you will be asked to vote again. One of the deciding factors for who wins this competition is how many of you changed your mind. How many of you were persuaded by the civil dialogue that you heard today? So please make sure that you vote at the end because that is a core portion of this competition. I'm now going to turn to the judges that we have. Yes.
Is there a way to make sure that there's an equal number of questions to each team?
So the question was, will we try and ensure that we get an equal number of questions to each team? As the moderator, I will try and ensure that we get an equal number of questions to each side and that each side will have an equal opportunity to respond. If you feel that I am not doing so, please make sure. If anyone feels that I am not doing so, or if either of the participants feel that you are not receiving an equal opportunity to speak, please just let me know and I'll ensure that I adjust if I deem that to be appropriate. So turning to our esteemed panel, we have Nadine Strawson. Nadine is a professor at New York University Law School. She's the past president of the American Civil Liberties Union and a leading expert on constitutional law and civil liberties. Her acclaimed 2018 book, Hate: Why We Should Resist It with Free Speech, Not Censorship, was selected by Washington University as its 2019 Common Read. Next to her, we have Pamela Peresky. And next to her, we have Pamela Peresky, and she is the Chief Research Officer to the President and CEO of FIRE, the Foundation for Individual Rights and Education. She is a psychologist, a researcher, a leadership consultant, and an author. Her work focuses primarily on leadership, happiness, kindness, and leading a meaningful life. And next to her is Representative Paul Boyer. Paul Boyer is a high school teacher and a state senator in District 20, which includes much of Glendale and North Phoenix. This is his 5th full year of teaching high school literature and history, and he graduated from ASU. But he doesn't know where any of you are from. And next to Representative Boyer is Seth Liebson, and he is a radio host on 960 AM KKNT in Phoenix, where he hosts the radio show, and he is the co-author of 2 books, including Why We Fight, and the ghost author of several others. He served as the chief of staff to former cabinet secretaries Jack Kemp and William Bennett. Now I'm going to introduce our teams, introduce the topic, and then we will get started. So our team here, who is our affirmative team, is Vincent Hasso and Finley Dutton-Reed. Vincent Hasso will be doing the opening, and Finley Dutton-Reed will be doing the closing. On our con side is Valley-Elza O'Keefe and Joshua Parthy. Valley-Elza is doing the opening, and Joshua will be doing the closing. Now, as I mentioned, our controversial topic that's going to be the subject of the debate is controversial speakers should be banned from campuses. All controversial speakers have First Amendment rights, but we realize that controversial speakers also bring with them extreme tensions. They also bring individuals that often incite violence. They use hurtful words. They are harassing, marginalizing, and sometimes victimizing. We must work to encourage and protect free speech, but some recent activities have led us to conclude that sometimes protecting free speech comes with an incredible cost. Sometimes that cost is emotional and physical safety. Sometimes it is the cost to the university of property damage, and sometimes it is the ultimate cost, the cost of human life. Now, as you saw in the resolution today, it is about controversial speakers, not controversial speech. But can we divide the two? That is a topic for these brilliant minds. So let's get started. Turning it over to our affirmative team.
Finn and I stand in the affirmation of the resolution that controversial speakers should be banned from campus. This is due to the underlying reason that controversial speakers incite a rise in hate speech. As the William Mitchell Law Review writes, back in 2012, 3 Supreme Court cases established criteria regarding speech on universities. The case of Bethel School District versus Frazier held that school officials are permitted to regulate lewd, vulgar, and indecent speech at school. In Hazelwood School District versus Kohlmeyer, in which the court held that school officials are allowed to impose reasonable restrictions on school-sponsored publications. In Morse v. Frederick, the court held that a principal may, consistent with the First Amendment, restrict student speech at a school event when that speech is reasonably viewed as promoting harm. Therefore, we believe that universities ought not welcome guest lecturers who undermine the ability of some groups to participate in productive speech. In practice, this will mean if the university deems the speaker controversial, a democratic student vote should be held to determine the university's association with the speaker. This leads us to our first contention, in which hateful speakers deprive marginalized students of their right to education. As Professor Allison Myra explains, hate messages and their stigmatization cause long-term psychological harm, causing victims to forego opportunities, avoid certain places, and importantly, engage in self-censorship. Under this framework, the traditional of more speech within the marketplace of ideas is unlikely to alleviate the hurt or provide relief. Richard Delgado further explains that hateful guest speakers can encourage similar behavior in students on campus. The psychological evidence suggests that permitting one person to say or do hurtful things to another increases the chance that he or she will do so again in the future. Moreover, others may believe it is permissible to follow suit. By allowing these controversial speakers, the negative team is only allowing for our universities to become more divisive and pin students against each other. Charles Jones from the National Council on Crime and Delinquency writes, more than half of the minority students experience isolation and discrimination and perceive the campus atmosphere as one of prejudice and discrimination. The problem of discrimination has been reinforced because the National Center for Education Statistics found a 40% increase in campus hate crimes between 2011 and 2016, with racial bias being the most common motivation for committing such crimes. And as the Center for American Progress explained back in August, that between 2016 and 2018, there have been at least 346 documented incidents of white supremacy supremacist propaganda on college campus, and since 2018 alone, there have been 434 of these incidents. We are experiencing a rise in discrimination against students on our college campuses. Racially motivated discrimination through speech is on the rise in our universities, as this can be highly contributed to controversial speakers who often make their personal views against minority groups known to their following. Now, our opponents may argue that these speakers are beneficial to students, but as the European Journal of Political Theory writes, some forms of speech lead to fear, flight, or fight rather than any learning process. Having a disruptive learning environment that protects students in an academic setting in which they no longer have to fear being discriminated against is clearly a limit on their education. And this leads us to our second contention, in which hateful speech promotes real racism. Again, Richard Delgado writes that many fail to realize is that eliminating hate speech goes hand in hand with reducing what they term real racism. Certainly being the victim of hate speech is a less serious affront than being denied a job, a house, or even an education. It is, however, equally true that a society that speaks and thinks of minorities divisively is fostering an environment in which such discrimination will occur frequently. Professor Alexander Tessis provides one of the many historical examples in which conquerors and explorers used negative images of Native Americans in order to justify their ultimate land grabs. And this was only further exploited by whites, in which they justified their land grabs by claiming that Native Americans were savages who were thought to be merely hunters and gatherers, in which they were denied the right of ownership. That is exactly what is happening with these controversial speakers, in which they are denying minority groups the ability to participate in our society. Finally, our third contention is the economic burden that this has on schools. Richard Spencer's white nationalist speech cost the University of Florida $500,000 in security costs. This was seen with Milo Yiannopoulos, in which it cost UC Berkeley $800,000 in security preparation and then over $100,000 in damages because of Yiannopoulos' promoting xenophobia, misogyny, white privilege, and a violent protest erupting. Finn and I want to make sure that students are able to live in a healthy environment, having inclusion rather than exclusion that these controversial speakers promote.
And now the opening statement from our con team. Valielza.
All right. So my partner and I stand here today in the negation of the following resolution. Controversial speakers should be banned from college campuses. And something my partner and I would like to stress today is that we really need to focus on the definitions, the definitions in the resolution tonight, especially the words controversial and banned, which the affirmation fails to address entirely. First, let's look at the word controversial. The connotation in the resolution implies that controversial speakers should be banned because controversy is negative. But I'd like to pose a question to you tonight. Why does the connotation of the word controversy have to be negative? It can also be positive. My partner and I strongly believe that controversy is the seed of discourse and public discussion and should be embraced. And controversy is entirely subjective, dependent on who defines what is controversial, whether you lean left or right on the spectrum, or dependent on what you consider to be a hot button topic or not, or the triggers of a particular person. Controversial is varied and subjective, and it's impossible to define a speaker as controversial by some sort of single ruling. Who gets to say that a speaker is controversial? Who gets to say that a felon coming to a college campus is controversial? Who gets to say that a Trump supporter is controversial? There's many arguments that you can make with the word controversial. And not only do they fail to provide any sort of definition for controversial tonight, but they just assume that there's some sort of agreed upon controversy in the room tonight. And my partner and I would like to say that this is a fundamental issue in the resolution that puts us in the negation. So for that reason, we can't really define controversial. And second, if you look at the word banned in the resolution, controversial speakers should be banned from college campuses. When you look at the history in the word banned, inevitably it silences a plurality of people and it silences opinion, and it leads to censorship, because depending on who's coming to speak, it's always going to be a missed opportunity to learn their viewpoint and to gain insight from their perspective. And dependent on who you're talking, there are many important human rights movements that occurred in the recent past in American history that were considered controversial. Martin Luther King Jr. was considered a controversial speaker. Should he have been banned from participating in campus protests? Same thing with the suffragette movement or the anti-Vietnam War protests. There are many movements in history that led to the advancement of human rights and social progress due to the fact that they were controversial and that they push public discourse and that they push us to face these painful and uncomfortable issues. And what my partner and I would really like to emphasize tonight is that sometimes it requires discomfort. It requires getting uncomfortable, it requires getting a little bit dirty and talking about the painful issues in order to make progress. We can't just ban things on the basis that they are deemed controversial or hot button. And so what I'd like to follow into is that it's a very much a slippery slope. If we were to enact some sort of rule banning controversial speakers from college campuses, what comes next? Are we going to ban them from visiting educational systems at all? Are we going to ban them from visiting workplaces? Are they going to be unwelcome on multinational news networks? Are they going to be unwelcome everywhere? It's a slippery slope where you start to ban speech on one area and then it quickly leads into banning and it quickly leads to suppression of free speech in other areas. And so it's very dangerous when you look at the potential impacts of suppression of free speech and the chilling of free speech. And finally, I'd like to point out to the flimsy rationale that's offered by the affirmative side. They cite violence, and they cite really violent protests, such as the one that surrounded Richard Spencer or Milo Yiannopoulos. Sorry, I can never say his name right. But if you look at those two speakers, you can see that they're often outside groups not associated with those controversial speakers, especially in the case of Milo Yiannopoulos. It was outside Antifa protesters that had actually incurred hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of property damage that led Berkeley to cancel the protest. It wasn't related to the speaker at all, rather the reaction to the speaker. And that sort of thing is impossible to predict, even if you wanted to be preemptive about it. It's impossible to be preemptive about what kind of reaction a controversial speaker may bring. Again, going back to the subjectivity of controversial and what controversy may mean. And I want to go over the affirmative case a little bit with the rest of my time. And I'd just like to point out the fact that the affirmative side does a very good job in proving a problem that we would like to recognize and we recognize needs to be worked on, that there is racial discrimination on college campuses, that minorities are still facing a lot of exclusion, and that hate speech is an issue. But we don't believe that suppression of free speech is the right way to go about it. Moreover, there is no causality in the case that they presented to you tonight. They only presented to you the fact that racial discrimination is occurring and that hate speech is going up and that white power protests are increasing, but they don't prove that this is related at all to controversial speakers. A single controversial speaker cannot be linked to the rise of racial discrimination or to the rise of white power movements. I would argue is rather an effect that I would argue is an effect of political polarization and other very multifaceted systems that leads to the proliferation of hate speech on campus. But you can't tie racism overall to controversial speakers on campus. It's bogus. It's a hasty generalization, and there's no causation provided at all in the affirmative case. That's all they prove. And the examples that they give you of Richard Spencer and Milo Yiannopoulos only proves that it's the outside community reaction to these controversial speakers that needs to be controlled. If we're going to do anything, what colleges should be doing is providing further security and engaging these speakers in discussions where everyone involved can be safe and everyone involved can express their opinions, because that is the most important thing tonight. The most important thing that we need to focus on is we need to focus on the protection of free speech, but also the protection of human life, because we agree what happened with those controversial speakers was egregious and it should never happen again. But the most important thing here tonight is that we don't suppress the rights of anyone involved when we're providing that protection. Thank you.
Now we are entering the second round of our final round of the competition. I know early there was a question or a request that I ensure that both sides receive an equal opportunity to answer any questions from the audience or from the moderator. I suppose I should let you know what I do for a job. I am a judge. I am the presiding judge of the Superior Court of Maricopa County. So one of my jobs is hopefully to keep a very fair and balanced courtroom and to ensure that everyone in front of me has an opportunity to be heard. I may not be successful, but I will strive for that, to attain that goal today. So now we are turning into our 30-minute presentation of answering questions from the audience and from the moderator. To summarize from the affirmative indicated that controversial speakers should be banned from campuses because discrimination is increased as a result of the presence of controversial speakers, that hateful speech leads to real racism, and that there is an economic burden associated with controversial speakers being present on college campuses. Our con team helped us identify some of the definitions involved in our resolution, addressing primarily the word controversial and also banned. So I'm going to turn to the affirmative side. I'm going to start my timer. And I'm going to turn to the affirmative side and ask you, do you agree with the definitions presented by the con team? And if not, why?
Well, I think that it is interesting that they say that there's no objective standard for controversy when one was actually presented in our case. And while it may not be objective, we believe that it can be implemented. We said that if there is a controversial speaker that would like to come to campus, the students would vote as to whether or not they would like their university to be associated with this speaker. Because that is what this is. If a speaker comes to campus, there is an endorsement by the university that they are there. There's an association. It is those students' degrees. Their diplomas have that university's name on it. They ought to be able to choose whether or not their university is associated with that controversial speaker.
And do you have a response?
Yes, we have a response. My response to that would be mainly that you're dancing around the question of identifying controversial, because again, even if we were to identify controversy with the majority vote, and a majority of students claim that they did not want their speaker associated with their university, for example, there's still a minority that's not being represented there. There's still a plurality of views that exists and that needs to be overall represented. And so whether or not a speaker comes to serve 1,000 people on the campus or 100 people on campus, they still have just as much right to come and present their viewpoint. And I really don't think that resorting to such mob rule is necessary. I think what's important is that if some students request a speaker, that the speaker has the right to be heard.
All right, turning over to the con team, how do you address the response? You indicated in your initial comments that there can be restrictions placed, correct? That there can be safety mechanisms put in place by the campuses. How do you address the affirmative position that it causes an economic burden on institutions and the institution shouldn't be responsible for bearing that economic burden?
I would argue that it varies depending on the speaker, and I think what is possible is that research can be conducted. For example, if we were to invite Milo Yiannopoulos, to this campus today, I think he would justify a much larger financial cost compared to a different university. And I think universities are well in their right to spend as much as necessary in order to secure the health and safety of students and as well as speakers and anyone who is on a campus. So I would argue that the financial burdens are outweighed by the necessity for safety.
Do you have a response?
Yes, we do. There have been a number of budget cuts to public universities around the nation, and their funds are frankly pretty low. And so this forces them to increase tuition. And I don't want my tuition to be going towards a speaker that is excluding marginalized groups from discourse. I think the money can be spent much better elsewhere.
Do we have any audience questions at this time?
Yes, my question is for the negative. You guys suggested the fact that once you start banning speakers from college campuses, that it's going to create a snowball effect. Is there any evidence for that, or is it just a slippery slope fallacy?
I would argue it isn't a slippery slope fallacy, rather is something that you can see in other countries, especially when increasing restrictions are placed on free speech, that inevitably it increases and increases to align with whatever influences or whatever parties are dominant in the particular government that's making the legislation. So I would argue that it's more of an empirical justification that inevitably you start placing restrictions on free speech here, that it grows and grows and grows until inevitably you no longer really have freedom of speech.
And how about from our affirmative side?
I think that we have proposed a pretty specific policy on this, and I think it's unreasonable to assume that it would snowball well out of control and well out of the scope of public universities. So I think that this is a slippery slope fallacy, and although my opponents may talk about evidence, they have cited none.
Yes, sir.
For the affirmative side, give us an example, please, of a female liberal speaker that you believe should be banned and why she should not be able to speak on campus, please.
So in regards to your question, just because there are so many public officials out there, what's important, I'm assuming that in regards to your question, it's probably targeting some sort of like politician or major public figure, right?
No, sir. There was a number of speakers mentioned, and I didn't hear a female mention that should be banned, so I thought it'd be interesting to see why it would be banned.
So in our case, I'm not entirely sure, just because there are hundreds of public speakers out there. But what's the important thing to understand with our side is that what we're advocating for is that these controversial speakers are generally individuals that incite violence. And we just wanted to note the most notable of these speakers, such as Richard Spencer and Milo Yiannopoulos, just because they've been the major individuals that have these massive university tours in which they go to every single university in order to spread their messages that often usually result in some sort of riot, and that creates a major economic burden on universities. So I'm sorry, I don't know any female liberal controversial speakers off the top of my head, but us as the affirmative, we wanted to just convey the idea that there are these controversial speakers that do incite violence and that they should be banned as a result.
And what do you think about that?
I think that possibly the point that you're trying to convey is that there is a bias that exists among the speakers that are deemed controversial, and inevitably they tend to be white, right-leaning men. And I think when you talk about controversial speakers being banned from campus and the implications of that you're going to see, again, the muting of a particular minority. And so I think it was a really potent example that you brought up, that they couldn't name a female liberal speaker that wanted to be banned, because more of the time we're starting to see conservative and right-leaning views more and more be silenced because of these more extreme speakers. And I think regardless of the level of their extremism, regardless of where they happen to be on the ideological spectrum, that they have a right to present their views on a campus.
Yes, in the second row.
Am I allowed to ask a question for both sides?
Yes.
So for my question for the negative side is, y'all talk a lot about how there's the need to have these uncomfortable discussions in order to build an education on certain topics, build resiliency in parts of our lives. But where do you feel that you draw the line for that in between, like a line in between where someone starts to feel resiliency versus when they start to feel resentment based on the speech? And for the affirmative side, where do you feel that if we don't have the controversy, how can we gain education on certain difficult topics without it being controversial?
So let's start with the negative side.
All right, so I think where the line is drawn between resiliency and resentment, I think that has to do with a lot of proper setup and, again, proper facilitation of whatever speaker you're going to bring to campus. And I think what's important is that not only that we have in the case of a speaker, like a detailed speaker profile, but that we give people proper trigger warnings, that we give people a very clear expectation about what's going to be discussed and what the view of the particular speaker is, so they know how the discussion is going to be conducted. Because I agree, you walk a very fine line between building that resiliency and growing resentment. But I think what's really important is that we recognize that there are certain triggers, we recognize there are certain topics that may be unsafe for people to talk about, but that we do so in a safe manner, and we make sure that everyone that is participating in the discussion is kept safe, comfortable, and they're only in discussion if they want to be.
And for our affirmative team, do you have a response to that? And also, can you focus on the question, which is the importance of gaining education through the controversy?
Yeah, I want to make it very clear that the affirmative side is not anti-controversy. We are anti-controversial speakers because of the specific impacts we have showed that they have. And the two of these we've talked about most thoroughly are the specific economic costs, and the second one is the fact that it deprives marginalized groups of an education. And it does this because psychological harms are very real. Richard Delgado, one of the people that we cite, one of the professors that we cite, shows and draws a causal link between the psychological harm and self-censorship and marginalized people avoiding certain places, not going to class. So we think that controversy can be good if handled in the correct manner, but specific controversial speakers harm the education of students and they harm the ability of the universities to continue to educate.
And do you have a response to the affirmative position on that issue?
I think especially what I take issue with the evidence that you're citing again is, or with that the affirmative is citing, is that they're linking causality between racial discrimination and psychological harms. But again, there's no causality between a controversial speaker and those psychological harms. They're extending the correlation, but there's no causative relationship between that speaker and the psychological harm. And so we're not denying that speakers can create harm. Of course they can. But what we're saying is that when you have a blanket statement and you say all these speakers create harm, ban all these speakers, it's impossible to define because again, they say they don't want to ban, they're not against controversy, but they have yet to define what that really means for us tonight. And I really want to emphasize that everyone should be thinking about what controversy could mean to you and the person sitting right next to you.
So let me turn back here to the affirmative team for just a moment. I know you want to respond, but I'm also going to add to what the negative team just said. You were just focused on the fact that it was controversial speakers, and she questioned the causality between controversial speakers necessarily communicating something that is controversial or racist. You indicated that there's an increase in discrimination and that hateful speech causes real racism. Are you truly focused on controversial speakers or controversial speech? And if you're focused on controversial speakers, how do the two premises related to hateful speech causing real racism and an increase in discrimination stand?
So I can understand the confusion, but we specifically cite Alice Myra on this, and she explains that when you have controversial speakers come onto campus, people mimic this behavior. And when they mimic this behavior, it becomes justified. Right? They feel that it's justified because they see someone that they idolize doing it on their campus, right there. They are far more likely, and the evidence shows they are far more likely to do it themselves. So there definitely is a causal link between seeing someone doing something and doing it yourself. We, after all, are social animals. We imitate what we see in others and what we see that society deems acceptable.
Yes.
So in the discussion that has proceeded, we've talked about constructive discussions. Would you deem a discussion that would come forward that would be controversial would be stem cell or cloning or heart replacement when it first came out? Or how about selective abortion? And would you take a student vote on that, where it's science or mathematics?
So I'm going to turn to the affirmative team first to answer that question.
So in regards to that, I love that the negative brought up MLK, how he had controversial ideas. But the important distinction with that is that he was a reasonable man. The speakers that we are talking about here on the affirmative side aren't reasonable people. They're people telling their followers to incite violence against the campus community that they're visiting, having violence and promoting these messages. So yes, while things like stem cell may be controversial, those aren't things that are inciting riots or violence against other students on campus. That's just the idea that's controversial. What this whole entire debate is talking about is the speaker themselves and them being controversial with inciting violence.
And for our negative team?
Yeah, I'd like to actually answer this specific question that you posed about stem cell research and topics like that. And I'd like to say that it is those ideas that allow us to advance as a society. When those ideas were first presented, they were controversial. And you could say that speakers bringing those ideas to campuses could be considered controversial speakers. And if, as the affirmative side is stating, if those speakers were banned by a majority vote of the students, would we be really where we are today as a society for that? And we'd like to argue and say that we wouldn't. And controversial speakers like that, namely speakers who are talking about controversial topics, like you said, about stem cell research, about selective abortion, things like that, that are controversial, if we ban those speakers from campuses, we are preventing students from the opportunity to learn about it and make decisions for themselves. And instead, we are making those decisions for them by limiting their access to information.
In the back?
Yes, I have a question. I'm a former student here, and I'm a taxpayer, and I have a question for the affirmative side, and the question is, the way that you determine what a controversial speaker is, according to what you've come up with, is that that controversial speaker will be decided by the student population. But the taxpayers of this state also pay for the universities. These universities belong to all of us in the state, so why should that only be left to the students? Why are you excluding an entire population of the entire state to determine what a controversial speaker would be?
I totally understand the concern, but I think that what's being misunderstood is the process. And so what we're saying is there's a two-step process. The first thing is the university administrators would look at the speaker and see if they have a history of inciting violence, right? Then it goes to a student vote. So it wouldn't go to a student vote if this person had no history of being a controversial speaker. So the administrators at the university would have a certain say in whether or not it went to a vote. It would just be making sure the students were actually heard.
And let me ask you a follow-up question, then I'm going to turn over to our negative team. But what if the speaker isn't the one that's controversial? What if it's the protesters, the heckler's veto? What if the controversy, the violence that's truly incited is not by the speaker, but by the protesters?
Well, I think it's very easy to sit back and assign blame to protesters, but I don't think that you can blame only one side of the equation in any of these instances. Regardless of whose fault it is, having controversial speakers on campus leads to the negative impacts that we have cited, the negative psychological impacts, the negative educational impacts, and the cost that has to be borne by the university itself. Even if it's not their fault, it still leads to those costs.
And from our negative team, can you address two topics? Can you address the question asked by the individual in the back, which focuses on what is representative? Who should be determining what is a controversial speaker? The population of the campus, or potentially all of those people who attend the speech, and all of those people who may be contributing to the financial resources of the institution? And also, can you address the issue related to the controversy, the controversial speaker truly being the protesters, not the speaker?
In response to the question about controversial speakers coming to campus and who gets to decide whether or not that speaker is deemed controversial, I'd like to again just state that we are in the negation of this statement, and we say that controversial speakers should be allowed to speak at campuses, and therefore it removes the entire responsibility from anyone to decide who is controversial and who isn't. We propose that any speaker, regardless of their viewpoint, if they wish to speak at a university, the university should allow for them to come and talk about their viewpoints to the students and allow them to make the decision. As for the second question, I'd like to pass it over to my partner.
Very quickly, could I just ask you to restate the second question?
So what we were discussing is the concept that the controversial speaker may not truly be controversial and incite violence. It may be violence that is created by the protesters, the heckler's veto, the individuals who can silence a voice by being the violent, victimizing protesters.
Of course, yes. And I think that's definitely an issue, and I think that's definitely what occurs with a lot of these controversial speakers. I think it's a combination of both. It's potentially some of their unpopular ideology mixed with a combination of unpalatable followers that like to destroy property and so on and so forth. It's a combination of both, and I think when you analyze those scenarios, you come to understand that it's not just one or the other. They're impossible to separate, and so at the end of the day, a single ban or a single legislative rule preventing these controversial speakers isn't the answer. What the answer is to provide proper security to ensure these protesters don't do, too much damage. At the end, you can only really react, because anything preemptive would just be a suppression of free speech.
In the middle in the blue shirt, sir? I know everyone with a blue shirt is like, yes, she called on me. I called on that guy.
My question is for the affirmative, although it does deal with a little bit of, for the negative. The affirmative did state that controversial speakers can incite violence in sort of this monkey see, monkey do type reaction. And I was wondering if a possible answer to that would be something like the event we're all attending right now. This event was designed to deal with potentially controversial topics. And what you think that would be, whether that would be a good thing to continue on or not.
Of course, and something that I would be very open to working on with the negative, because I think the most powerful thing that we can leave here tonight is with a clear answer on the topic, is what can we do aside from straight out banning? My partner and I can go on and on about how bad it is to ban a speaker, but at the end of the day, there's different ways that we can deal with these so-called controversial speakers. First, we have to make sure to very clearly define controversy, the types of controversies, the sort of damages and potential impacts they could have on the safety of the student body, and then how to deal with it from there. But it can't just be, a single action. It has to be an education campaign. It has to be consistent with the mission of the university, consistent with the community that we have here. Everyone here coming together to learn, to collaborate, and understand where that speaker is coming from. And so I completely agree with you. I think this event is a great, example of doing that. Yeah.
From our affirmative side?
So this event is not promoting violence at all.
Not yet.
As I brought up at the end of my speech, that these controversial speakers often incite exclusion, we are being very inclusive here at this event with allowing people of all different viewpoints. It's open to the public, in which anyone can attend, whereas these controversial speakers are inciting violence and they're excluding specific populations away from their events because of their targeted messages.
The black sweater and the glasses, who's pointing to herself in a big smile, very excited that I've called on her. Yes.
My question is for the affirmative side. And I was wondering about the cases that you cited at the beginning of your opening were Frazier and Morris, but all of these cases were about high schools. And so how would that translate into the different rights that college students have as opposed to high schoolers?
So I'm glad you brought that up, because yes, while these cases were as a result based on high schools, they're often applied to things such as universities. Whenever speech cases come up with universities, lawyers and other scholars often cite these Supreme Court cases as being legal precedent for any sort of motion or ruling in regards to speech on universities. So yes, while they did occur on high school, they're often also applied in other court cases to universities.
And what about from the con side? Do you believe that there's a distinction between controversial speakers in the audience being young children or high school students versus college-age people who are on campuses and are in an environment in order to facilitate growth and learning?
Absolutely. And I'd like to say that high schoolers are very different from college students. I think most of us college students here today can say that our experience here at a university is far different than what it was in a high school. And most importantly, which I think is the most relevant to this specific conversation, is the age of the people involved. People in high schoolers are minors. They are in an environment where they're here to learn, whereas most college students are over 18. They are of the legal age to vote. And it is this specific age group that we must ensure has the ability to listen to different opinions. They must be able to listen to controversial speakers, listen to what they have to propose so that they can make decisions for themselves. If the university, based upon a history of existing violence, decides we are not going to allow our students to listen to this viewpoint, how is that benefiting those students and preparing them for a life in the world where they will need to vote and make decisions that affect us as a country as a whole?
And let me follow up and ask you a question to that. So you talk about the age of the high school students versus those college-age students. What about the distinction between a high school student can just stay home? If they know that a controversial speaker is going to be on campus that day, their parents or they can choose to stay home. This controversial speaker is coming to your home. They are coming to where you live, where you eat, where you go to class. Should that matter?
I do think that's an important distinction. I definitely think that there is a difference. If you're living on campus, you can't necessarily escape the all the processions of an invited speaker, whereas at high school you can just decide to spend the day home. So I definitely agree that there is a major difference, but I think what we really want to emphasize is the decision-making capabilities between a high school student and a college student. Neurologically, there's big changes that occur from high school age to college age. There's the further development of the prefrontal cortex, which is the part of the brain that's associated with decision making, and it grows and it doesn't actually complete maturity until 21, 22. So that encompasses a lot of college students, but college students are much further in their development of their prefrontal cortex and decision making abilities compared to high school students. And so what I would argue is that college students have better faculties and better modes of independence compared to high school students. Even though they're forced to be on campus, they're not forced to be in the same room. They're not forced to be in a small high school necessarily. There's other places on campus they can explore. There's other campuses they could venture to if they go to ASU, for example. I would argue that college students, because they have that heightened decision making, we can entrust them to know how to behave if they're ever put in a situation where a controversial speaker makes them feel not at ease.
And what about from our affirmative side?
Well, I think that it's important to acknowledge that even if you are over the age of 18, even to 80, you can still be subject to psychological harms and the effects that these speakers bring and what students do as a result of seeing these speakers. So just because someone is 18, not 17, doesn't mean that they are not entitled to a safe space to have their education free from the influence that such bigoted statements can bring with them, and free from the destructive nature that these statements instill into the student body around them.
Our blue shirt, who got rejected last time, but is still wearing his blue shirt.
Thank you. I have a question for the negative, but the affirmative can jump in if they want. I think it's pretty clear that there has been an increase in the type of controversial speakers that the affirmative talks about, white, right-leaning men over the past several years, that has been undeniably led to violence, that has undeniably led to psychological harm. So if just letting it alone and letting it have there be a free marketplace of ideas has produced all these vile characters and these vile speakers, then why shouldn't we turn it over to the students? Considering leaving it alone has been the status quo, and only now are we seeing a big change without students input.
Yeah, of course. I would definitely agree with some of the links that you made earlier in the question, but not all of them. And so you're dealing with a lot of complex phenomena in terms of the rise of hate speech, the rise of white nationalists, and I don't think they can be pinpointed to, just speakers coming to campuses more, so people feel more racist, so people feel more excluded. I don't think it's necessarily a linear progression like that. I think it's much more circular, and there's a lot more elements to take into consideration. So that's a little oversimplified, I would argue. But in terms of how, in the status quo, how you say it's been left alone, laissez-faire, I would say that it needs to continue that way, because in the past we've seen that controversial speakers, what's controversial today is different than what it was in the 80s, 70s, 60s, right? But at the end of the day, dealing with that controversy head on rather than restricting it has led to so much social progress and advancement. And of course, it's hard to see the advancement that would come from engaging head on with white nationalist speakers, for example, but I think the challenge that we're facing today that's different from the challenges that we faced in the past is the necessity of including all these viewpoints and educating people, and not just excluding them and making them feel further isolated, right? It's more of a call-in culture and making sure that people feel included and not embarrassed or vilified for the views that they may hold. And I think that's the challenge we're facing today. And
I'm going to turn it over to the affirmative side to get your position.
So right, I'm glad you brought that up, because what's important to understand is that these controversial speakers are not promoting social progress. The negative just said that speakers in the past have promoted social progress. These speakers, Milo Yiannopoulos talking about xenophobia, misogyny, and white privilege, that's not social progress. That's only targeting minority groups and not allowing people to come out and socially prosper. That's the underlying reason with these controversial speakers. Students are straight up just tired of having violence occurring on their campus, so a change needs to happen, and this is perhaps one of the best changes because it allows students to not only have their voice heard, but it also helps universities determine on what kind of message they want their student body to be associated with.
All right.
My question is really for both of you. Would banning controversial speakers lead to a student body that tends to be monolithic in its thinking, or would banning controversial speakers create an environment that leads to greater civil discourse and debate?
Now, this is going to be our last question, and I'm going to turn it over to the affirmative.
I certainly don't think that banning controversial speakers will make the student body monolithic. We obviously have diverse student bodies all across the US at our colleges. And it is really a matter of how these ideas are presented. And this is drawing a line between controversy and controversial speakers. So if you have a controversial speaker that is targeting marginalized groups, that is the wrong way to present their ideas. So if you want to talk in a controversial manner, that is fine. But you cannot do it in a way that excludes others' ability to participate in the discussion. I think that we can have controversy without controversial speakers.
And what about from our con side?
Well, I'd like to say that, can I just have a restatement of the question, just that I...
Sure, would you mind restating your question? Or if you want me to, I can, but would you like to restate? Let me phrase it, and if you feel like I haven't done a good job, I'll have you stand up and help me out. Is the exclusion of controversial speakers really going to homogenize the viewpoint of the student body?
Yes. Yeah, my partner and I would definitely say that yes, it would homogenize the viewpoint of the student body. And I'd like to give an example. Let's say that we lived in the era, or let's say Martin Luther King lived today. He was a controversial speaker, and if for some instance the university decided that Martin Luther King Jr. was a controversial speaker and he should not be allowed on campuses, and the students on that campus were not given that viewpoint about civil rights and civil liberties, I do believe, my partner and I do believe that it would have created a monolithic viewpoint of all the students because they would never have been exposed to such a viewpoint from someone like him. If you'd like to expand on that?
Nope, she's not going to be able to expand on that. So, all right, ladies and gentlemen, that concluded our second round. Now we are going to move into our third round, which is our summation, and I'm going to call up Finley for the closing.
I want to ask all of you an important question. What does it mean to have free speech? We believe on the affirmative side that it means expression and it means inclusion. Hateful speakers on campus foster oppression, not inclusion, and they foster silencing, not expression. We believe this for 3 reasons. First, hateful speakers deny marginalized groups their ability to express themselves and to have an education. Now, our opponents have tried to muddy the waters, but we have brought forward solid psychological evidence suggesting that when you have someone that is targeting you specifically as a minority person, this leads to self-censorship. And this obviously is not good for free speech. If we want to promote an environment where people feel heard, we cannot stop them from speaking by targeting them with bigoted language. Second, having controversial speakers on campus leads to an increase in racism. How we talk about people influences how we treat them. If someone is constantly telling you that someone is subhuman, that they are trash, you are far more likely to, one, believe it over time, and two, treat them that way yourself. This is what these controversial speakers bring to campus. They have made their names by making bigoted statements that sell well in the press, but are untrue and create grave psychological harm for students on campus. Third, which is something that really wasn't talked about that much in the cross-examinations, is the cost. I think that this is really important for you to understand, because regardless of where you stand on this issue from other perspectives, there is a financial burden, a substantial financial burden that is placed on institutions when they take these speakers. Because regardless of the blame you assign, whether or not you think it's the protesters, whether or not you think it's the speaker themselves, it is undeniable that schools are spending millions, I repeat, millions of dollars on security, riot prevention, and riot cleanup for controversial speakers who only serve to target marginalized groups on campus. They would like you to believe that we are advocating that any speaker that stirs the slightest bit of controversy in the student body would be banned. But this is simply untrue. We are only talking about the speakers that, one, have a history of promoting violence, and two, that a vast majority of the student body would not want to be associated with. It is these students' right to choose whether or not their university, the insignia that they will have on their diploma, that they will carry into their careers, is associated with a Klansman, a white supremacist, a bigot. They should have this right, and I would not have you deny it from them. Today, we must draw a clear distinction between controversial speech and controversial speakers. Presentation is absolutely essential for distinguishing between the two. Targeting marginalized groups on the one hand and promoting inclusion and free expression of ideas on the other. So we ask you to vote for inclusion and against oppression. Thank you for your time.
And now the consummation from Joshua.
Well, I'd like to first thank the affirmative side for presenting their case, and now I would like to present the closing statement for us, the negative side, saying that controversial speakers should not be banned from college campuses. What the affirmative side said today is that there is a link, albeit casual, between racism and psychological harms, and that some speakers have a high cost for protection, which can be economically burdensome for the universities. They said that controversial speakers incite racism, which deprives the right to education of certain minorities. And they also said that hate speech is on the rise. However, we'd like to also agree that our colleagues make a good point here, namely that discrimination is absolutely a problem and that it should be fixed. However, not in the way that they're proposing. They never made a concrete definition of controversy. They loosely related it to a history of violence. And this is why our stand matters. Controversy is the heart of democracy. It is the very method by which we advance as a society. Would we have had the successes of the civil rights movement, of the women's suffragette movement, or movements like that without controversy? Back in those days, those were controversial topics. Speakers advocating for those were controversial speakers. If we banned those ideas from college campuses, would we have had such a flourishing of ideas, such a variety of opinions presented to students, presented to those people who make up the future of our country? And if they hadn't been presented those ideas and such a variety of opinions, they would have been just left in the dark. And that is why we must give college students, those who will be our future, the ability of a variety of opinions. Universities must ensure that speakers on their campuses provide their students with the background, with the knowledge needed for them to make decisions on their own. We cannot have universities make those decisions for them. Hate speech, which the affirmative side brought up, is also a problem, but that must be won over by more speech. It must be won over by societal change. We cannot remove the rights of students, and we cannot remove the rights of speakers to present their ideas to students by simply saying that they incite hate speech. If we make the decision to limit speakers on campus just dependent on their ideology, if we give universities the right to decide whether or not their students should have access to information, where are we going as a country? And more importantly, where are we going as the future of America? Thank you.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, now it is your turn. We are going to have a second poll. Our intern is going to come down and give you the logistics, but we are now asking you to vote again on our resolution. Controversial speakers should be banned from campuses. Controversial speakers should be banned from campuses. All right, folks, while we finish up the voting process, let me go over a few announcements and just let you know about what this experience has been for these students. For those of you who are just joining us and haven't been traveling the entire journey of the students today, these individuals that are seated to my left and right have managed to be persuasive storytellers. They have engaged in civil dialogue. They have proposed solutions, and they have effectively convinced an audience to change their mind. The Board of Regents created this competition in order to demonstrate the importance of civil dialogue and civil discourse on controversial issues in a safe space where we can do it professionally, responsibly, and civilly. And I want to acknowledge all of our participants today. I know at the very end of the comments during the summation, there was a recognition about our future. I feel incredibly confident about where our future is, where our future is going, when it rests in the hands of the people that we saw today. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I invite you to join us for the reception where they will announce the team that won the Regent Cup. It will be in the reception hall, and everyone is welcome. It will be right outside the doors immediately following this event. So thank you all for your time, your attendance, and your participation in this extraordinary endeavor.